Welcome everybody. JNF Canada is very, very pleased to have you joining us for this webinar with Professor Gil Troy. Our National President, Wendy Spatzner, will introduce Gil momentarily. I just want to say just a couple of words just for housekeeping in advance of the call, of the webinar rather. First is that please stay on mute function. There's often a lot of background noise and that's distracting to those listening. So if you stay on mute, that's ideal. When you have questions after the presentation, you can send them via chat directly to Wendy Spatzner, and she will then collect the questions, and we won't be able to cover all of them, but she'll pick the most salient and she'll address them to Gil. And so direct your questions in the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see that there is a little rectangular box with chat underneath it. You click on that, and you click for Wendy Spatzner. You can send her your questions directly. So I just want to say one word about why we're doing these webinars. During this time of social and physical isolation, it's hard for many of us who feel distant from Israel. Many of us have plans to travel to Israel for Passover time. Many of us have family and friends that we plan on seeing on a regular basis when we visit Israel, and it's not coming to fruition. This is one small way that we're able to keep the connections palpable between Canadians and Israel. That's what JNF is all about, building those bridges and connections between Canadians and Israelis. And so by providing a whole host of webinars, whether it's about politics or the economy or about scientific breakthroughs, whatever it might be, JNF wants to connect our supporters with the dynamic situation in Israel. So we will be providing multiple webinars on the go forward, as we don't expect this travel ban to Israel and the social isolation to close anytime soon. So please join us for future ones. We'll continue to send out the information about it. And this is one wonderful way to stay connected in a digital way with our beloved country of Israel. The last thing I just want to say before I turn it over to Wendy to introduce Gil is one of the ways that JNF is helping to connect Canadians with Israel is we've identified that the most pressing need right now for the Israeli public is they need ventilators. There is a shortage not of dozens or hundreds, but many, many hundreds, approaching thousands of ventilators are needed for the country. And JNF is going to embark upon a campaign to purchase ventilators for hospitals in the periphery as well as Jerusalem. And you will be receiving information about it shortly. This is a life and death situation, and you have the opportunity to play a role in doing some life-saving work for the people of Israel. So do keep your eyes and ears open for our upcoming campaign. We've collected a matching grants from a number of very generous donors. And so we're going to use it as an opportunity for the entire country to participate and to know that we're not just collecting money, but we're leveraging the dollars collected so we can do something really outstanding for the people of Israel. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Wendy, who again is the National President of JNF Canada, and she will take the opportunity to introduce Gil Troy.
Thank you, Lance. It's my pleasure to introduce Gil Troy, a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, currently living in Jerusalem. Gil Troy is an award-winning American presidential historian and a leading Zionist activist. In the foreword to Troy's latest book, The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland Then, Now, and Tomorrow, Natan Sharansky writes, "This magnificent work is the perfect follow-up to Arthur Hertzberg's classic, The Zionist Idea. Combining, like Hertzberg, a scholar's eye and an activist's ear, Gil Troy demonstrates that we now live in a world of Zionist ideas with many different ways to help Israel flourish as a democratic Jewish state. Recently designated an Allgemeiner J100, one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life, Troy wrote The Age of Clinton, America in the 1990s, and 10 other books on the American presidency. One leading historian called The Age of Clinton the best book on the man and his times. Troy edited and updated another classic, the multi-volume History of American Presidential Campaigns, originally edited by Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. and Fred Israel. He's now writing new essays on the 2012 and 2016 elections. Troy has published essays in the American, Canadian, and Israeli media, including writing essays for the New York Times campaign stops in 2012 and 2016. He wrote a weekly column for the Daily Beast, Secret Lives, putting current events in historical perspective, and writes a weekly column for the Jerusalem Post. Please join me in welcoming Gil, who is a fellow Montrealer, and we've met many times in Israel, and it's always my pleasure to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Lance. It's very moving to hear about the generosity. Moving in some ways is the wrong word because it's just kind of expected, but one shouldn't take it for granted. And it really is moving to hear how all of us are working together, and JNF is stepping up during this very difficult period. And I want to start by wishing everybody a safe and happy and healthy Pesach. And the great Zionist writer and poet Chaim Nachman Bialik said that reading something in translation is like kissing through a handkerchief. And Zoom is kind of like that too. And as I'm embracing you through this handkerchief, I'm remembering that beautiful Shabbat dinner that we had with you, Wendy, and Lance, and I'm sure a number of you on the call. I think it was just a year or two ago. You were kind enough to invite my family to the Orient Hotel, and I look forward to resuming that kind of personal contact very soon. So what we want to talk about today, and I've changed my talk 3 times in the last hour because the reality has changed 3 times in the last hour, is what's going on in Israeli politics and the current chaos that we're seeing, where for the last year or so, Israel loves democracy so much that we've had not 1, not 2, but 3 elections. And how we try to understand what that means and how we understand what's going on right now with the current situation. So I'm going to give a bit of an update, asking the question, as you saw, is this good for the Jews or bad for the Jews, or what's good for the Jews, what's bad for the Jews? I'll speak for about 15, 20 minutes and then open it up for questions. So the elections of March 2020, which occurred after the elections of September and the elections of April, I think actually were quite clear. There were 2 very clear messages. 1, the Israeli people are not ready to fire Bibi Netanyahu. But 2, they're not yet ready to fully rehire him either. And people say, oh, that's not a clear message. I actually think after 3 rounds, there's a message there. And underlying that is a message of, we want a national unity government. And we've also seen actually that in the 3rd round, in the March elections, Netanyahu did better than expected. And if we look at these numbers, Likud's 1,352,000 votes is really an increase of about 200,000. And even more distressing for the anti-Netanyahu clamp, if you look at the 1.2 million votes that Blue and White had, that is not much of an increase from the first election. Now think about it. In the first round, in September 2019, in April 2019, Gantz and his party, Benny Gantz, Ashkenazi, Bughi Ya'alon, and Yair Lapid came from nowhere. They were an improvised party. They had some government money from Yair Lapid's party, but they really didn't have the big bucks to organize, to mobilize. And then when they won over 30 seats, when they went into rounds 2 and rounds 3, they had a much bigger budget for campaigning. Nevertheless, they didn't move the needle. Nevertheless, they weren't able to get more votes. And we saw that, in fact, in the last round, as I said, Netanyahu got more votes. And so that is actually, Gantz's amazing success this year is that he really created this party from nowhere, and it has become the #2 party. And as we'll see, it's swallowed up Israel's Labor Party. On the other hand, his great failure was, since his debut in April, almost a year ago, he has not been able to make a gain. And I think that was a failure because he didn't understand how to reach out to Mizrahim, to Sephardim. He didn't reach out to any of those people who say, yeah, I'm unhappy with Bibi's corruption, but in a crisis, I'm happy to have Bibi. And then, of course, even by the March election, this Corona crisis was hanging over everybody's head. And so let's just take a quick look. And here we see the numbers. So just quickly, the magic number, of course, is 120. And Likud ended up with 36, Kahol Lavan with 33. The Arab joint list, and one of the things that Bibi Netanyahu accomplished in the same way that he was able to increase his numbers, he also, with his bigotry, was able to unite the Arabs, who traditionally have been very, very good at squabbling among themselves. We see Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu with 7, and Labor with 7, and Shas, Yamina, and the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, with 9, 6, and 7. Now, one of the ways I thought I'd get into this conversation is I would show you today's newspaper, both the Jerusalem Post and Yediot Ahronot. First, to just give a little bit exactly what Lance was talking about at the beginning, some atmospherics. So look at the headline, Leil HaSeger. Instead of Leil HaSeder, instead of Seder night, this is the night of being closed in. And look at this headline, Kimat Memshala. We almost have it. We're on the cusp. As Lance was opening this call, I was literally looking on my other screen to see, and it looked like the latest headline I'm seeing is that the crisis between Blue and White and Likud is really quite serious, and they're not sure that they will come to an agreement. And we'll see why in a moment. So first they play with, but Yediot Ahronot, which is the most popular tabloid in Israel, they're forming, Jerusalem Post will have very, and I write for the Jerusalem Post, but they'll have very steady Eddie, straightforward headlines. Netanyahu declares national lockdown. Yediot Ahronot is going to be playing between Leil HaSeger and Leil HaSeder. They're going to be talking about, instead of Manishtana halayla hazeh kulanu misubin, they're singing halayla hazeh kulanu babatim. We're all in our houses, and with pictures of the lockdown. And then, just to give again a little more flavor, the egg crisis, the great egg crisis of 2020. I was very smart, and a week ago made sure to gather the eggs, not from my farm, but from our local grocery, that would be necessary for us to have Seder. But there's been a bit of a crisis, and we see also the long lines in the groceries. Again, my wife Linda and I have been going back and forth in anticipation, so we didn't have to stand on those lines. But that's the background. In that situation, most Israelis are happy to have Benjamin Netanyahu at the helm. Many of my friends from the left, who are very critical of Bibi, are saying, I dislike Bibi, but I like his leadership here. And especially when my friends on the left compare Bibi Netanyahu's leadership during this crisis to Donald Trump's leadership during this crisis, and I'm not endorsing one or the other, I'm trying to be nonpartisan here, they say, you see, we at least can rely on him in a crisis. And so the deal that seemed to be on the cusp of being signed, with Netanyahu continuing as prime minister and Gantz coming in, seemed, as his partner, seemed to be a reflection of the Israeli consensus, and seemed to be, after 3 rounds, as chaotic and as absurd as it's been, a kind of happy ending for most Israeli voters. And here the Hebrew headline captures the Kuval al Kavasium, the delay just by the finish line. They were just about to sign, and now it starts getting interesting. Now it starts getting confusing, because we're going to start seeing some of the issues that are emerging. So in the Jerusalem Post headline, it also seemed this morning that we were just about to have an agreement as they near deal, right? Al Kavasiyum by the finish line, by the near deal. But two of the issues pop up. One, and the big issue, and apparently the issue that might scotch the whole deal, is a fight which is really a core constitutional fight, a democratic battle over who should have power. In the United States, we talk about separation of powers, and in Canada, we have the power of the legislator. With a court that's often subservient to the legislature. In Israel, which is more a parliamentary democracy, more like Canada, nevertheless, over recent years, the court has gotten more and more power. And Israelis on the right in general think that the court is not only a force for the left, but also a force against democracy. And so they want less power for the courts. And my friends on the left feel, oh no, it's an important block against too much legislative power, against too much prime ministerial power. And that seems to be the issue that's breaking down negotiations right now. Related, and here we see the wonderful contradiction even in the Jerusalem Post itself, that on page 1, we were learning that a possible annexation of the Jordan Valley area, which was won in 1967, was going to be a natural result of a Gantz-Netanyahu blue and white Likud alliance. And yet, the analysis that we're reading on page 2 is saying, well, not exactly, because Benny Gantz, a former general, former chief of staff, is very wary of a unilateral annexation. Partially, he worries about the Palestinians because he wants ultimately to have a two-state solution and some kind of deal. But he's most worried about Jordan. He's most worried about instability in Jordan, which has been a peace partner for Israel for 25 years and a force of stability for about 40 years. And will that kind of unilateral move, even if it's acknowledging a fact on the ground, lead to a major problem in Jordan? So I don't know. If you ask me what's Gantz going to do, this suggests that by July, he might have been ready to annex to Jordan Valley. This suggests that he actually would be inside the government putting the brakes on. And that's part of the delightful confusion. Now we see, we're back to Yediot Achronot, the rumors this morning of what the cabinet would look like. And this will help us get a little bit of a sense of some of the political personalities playing out. So here's Bibi Netanyahu from Likud, Benny Gantz from Kahol Lavan, blue and white. We see that his partner, who went in with him, because blue and white, of course, split, Gabi Ashkenazi, would either be would be the foreign minister or education minister in this configuration. Blue and white would also get the Speaker of the Knesset, and right now Benny Gantz very cleverly is Speaker of the Knesset, because one of the things he's holding over Netanyahu's head is that he can, if he can't quite pull together 61 that he needs for a government, he has the votes to pass laws that, first of all, will block Bibi Netanyahu from getting immunity. That's more or less off the table. But he can also pass laws that limit Netanyahu's ability to serve in cabinet, except as prime minister, once his trial begins. So we're playing a very high stakes game of chicken. We see here that the Sar Mishpatim, the justice minister, would also be blue and white. One of the things that's surprising in this coalition is that despite the fact that Benny Gantz's party split, and so he's going in with half the number of votes that Netanyahu has, he will have about half the cabinet seats. And especially this important seat in justice. And that's been a source of rebellion on the right. Now, of course, we also have to see the crucial role of the health minister. And there too, look, I learned from Yediot Achronot that Gabi Ashkenazi is going to be either foreign minister or education minister. I go to the Jerusalem Post and I learn he either wants to be foreign minister or health minister. Why? Because right now, Israel is in a situation where it has a health minister, Yaakov Litzman, from the ultra-Orthodox Haredi world, who is not quite living in the 21st century. Now, of course, inevitably, the haters take the absurdities of Israeli politics, take the absurdities of Israel, and push it even further. And so we saw this claim. First part is true. He's health minister. Second part is true, that he's tested positive. But the third part is not true. He was not saying that the virus was punishment for homosexuality. Some ultra-Orthodox were. Some ultra-Orthodox have behaved irresponsibly in this crisis. But while I have my concerns about a health minister who isn't as sophisticated as I would want my health minister to be, I also don't want to demonize him or the ultra-Orthodox. And while I'll criticize some ultra-Orthodox and some ultra-Orthodox behavior, I also want to point out a very moving moment that I had this week. A friend of mine's father died, and I watched the funeral by Zoom, and I watched this kind of scene take place, where the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, is ultra-Orthodox people, and they are risking infection themselves. So precisely at the time that we can criticize some ultra-Orthodox politically, let's also remember that these people are not just doing their religious duty, but they're doing their civic duty. And I think those of us, it's dismaying to me that those of us who are so quick to fight anti-Arab bigotry, and I'm one of them, are sometimes not quick enough to fight ultra-Orthodox bigotry. One of Netanyahu's problems is he's not just facing a rebellion from the left and from the center, who are saying, enough, we've had enough of your demagoguery. You have 4 corruption charges pending. It's time for you to retire. But here we see from the right, and this is an opinion column saying to Naftali Bennett, who's the head of the Yamina party, you know what, go to oppositia, go to opposition. The right is dismayed that Gantz got such a good deal. The right is dismayed that Gantz is going in with half the number of votes in the Knesset, but is getting half the number of cabinet seats. And then we have to mark one of the challenges on the left, that the Labor Party, the party of Golda Meir and David Ben-Gurion, the party of Moshe Dayan and Abba Eban, the party that founded the state, is basically being folded up into blue and white. And that shows the chaos and the weakness on the part of the left. I want to finish with 4 thoughts. One is that as this situation continues, the politics will get uglier, but in the end, I actually think that we're close to some kind of agreement, partially because of the crisis and partially because of the consensus. But let's also just step back and see that with all this insanity, Israeli society is doing remarkably well. Look at this delightful meme that's been passing around. We'll survive Corona, but what I really worry about my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and great-grandchildren. A year after year, they're going to be locked down for 2 weeks, only eating canned food, singing songs to the Lord from royals scrawled on toilet paper. These are going to be the Corona holiday rituals. And we see how Israelis are kind of coming together. And this perhaps even better. Your ancestors fought Nazis, paved roads, drained swamps. All you need to do is sit on your hands, keep your butt on the couch and watch Netflix. Do you think you can handle that? The Israeli ability to laugh, the Israeli ability to keep its society strong, even if its institutions are flagging. The Israeli society, the Israeli ability to continue functioning in this year of a caretaker government and chaos is really quite remarkable. And if you'll indulge me for 2 more minutes, I want to share with you, let's see if this works, a clip from Israel's Saturday Night Live, which is called Eretz Nehederet. And they did a little bit, I apologize, it's all in Hebrew, but I think you'll get the essence. They did a little sing-along of all of these top celebrities in Israel from this very popular show. And just watch the tone that comes through. They cut up the curtains. We spoke to Grandma and Grandpa. We're addicted to the screen.
מתלונן, זה כמו שבועיים
It's like a
בצימר.
2-week vacation.
נשמה זה כמו לדחוף את האצבע לדימר.
No, it's like turning down your life.
כולם ביחד עכשיו. בדקה לתקיע. בוא תראה לי בגב. לא הזמן לא עובר, זה משפחה בהסגר.
This is a family in lockdown.
תשמיץ טיפה לפה תגרגר. כל שנייה יונית אומרת שזה רק ייגמר. משפחה בהסגר.
Our family in lockdown. This came from the curtains.
שמענו סטטיק בן-אל. פאקינג עדל חסון. קיבלתי אקסבוקס לראש, נדפק לי הזיכרון.
His memory went bad. His memory went bad.
הזיכרון, שיחקנו כתנוחה. נתקע לי גדול בגרון. לא התקלחתי תקופה.
They haven't showered, they haven't shaved.
על מה אתה מתלונן? שבועיים בלי עבודה. עוד סבב קעות אחד, אני אורז מזוודה. תתייחס לילדה, בוא תגלה הבנה. היא מקבלת ים של יחס ממיכל הקטנה. לא הזמן לא עובר, זה משפחה בהסגר. קשוק מעל קודשל, תשמיץ טיפה לפה וגרגר. לא מסוגל לשמוע שוב את הסימן טוב חומר.
What's the point here? What you're seeing is families in lockdown. But some of the things that are coming out from Hollywood have shown the Backstreet Boys or even Gal Gadot in their amazing mansions, living a life that's not like most Americans. These guys, who are the most famous faces in Israel, among the most famous faces in Israel, are living very middle-class, very normal lives. And my kids and so many of my friends love this video because it caught a kind of Israeliness, it caught a down-homedness, and if you can follow along in the Hebrew, it also caught a kind of cleverness that continues. And that's really the challenge for all of us, to continue to be laughing, to continue to be smiling, to continue to have vision, and to continue to build this amazing community called the Jewish community. Because we know that no matter what's going on, we're never alone. We're connected, we're united, we're looking out for one another. And despite the distance, despite the social isolation, despite my Seder of 3 and your Seder, I'm sure, of 2 and 3 and 4, we're going to be together. And we're going to be together tonight, tomorrow night, and every night, because we're never alone. Thank you very much.
Join the two together.
Thank you, Gil. So I'm waiting for some people to send me questions. That was a very uplifting song. And I guess in these times, you want to feel a little bit of that. I can read one of these. What do you think? Let's see. Oh, here, some other ones. Let's see. There is one here. I don't know if I'm supposed to say who it's from, or it's just, I'll just read the question. I don't know if we have to kind of say who said what. Let's see. Gil, the proposed unity government, do you hear me, Gil? Okay. The proposed unity government seems like a conglomeration of people who betrayed their voters and their main messages with the excuse to join a government and save the country. What are your thoughts?
You know, this is one of the major debates going on right now on the left. The 4 very strong-willed characters who joined Kahol Lavan, who made the blue and white party, Ashkenazi, Ya'alon, Lapid, and Gantz, came in with one glue, right? One thing uniting them, which is no Bibi, no more Bibi. And I think that after round 1, had Gantz immediately gone in with Bibi, it would have been valid to say, you know what, this guy's betraying his core voters, his core message. And perhaps with round 2. But I think with round 3, when we saw, again, the failure of those 4 to move the needle and get an extra 50,000, 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 votes. And we saw in round 3 that Netanyahu did get those votes, that jump. when we saw all of a sudden that this really is, and it's interesting, the language has shifted. For a long time, people were talking about a national unity government. They're talking about a national emergency government. And what's really interesting is we see the split because at the end of the day, among the four, two of them, Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi, who are patriots, who both served as chiefs of staff, said, you know what? As much as I cannot stand Bibi Netanyahu, as much as I'm appalled by his corruption, as much as I am fed up and I think we need a change, I think we need an emergency government right now. And I don't think that they did it for cynical reasons. I don't think they did it, as we say in Israel, for their Volvos. I really think they did it for a sense of national unity in response to the emergency. It's, on top of what I'm talking about, this mixed message of we want you to unite, we also have this Corona crisis, and so I think it's fair to look in this case, and I am at other points I'm always happy to see the cynical take on what's making a politician tick. I think in this case they really did it out of patriotic motives, and I think Benny Gantz knew, especially, that he was putting his credibility at risk. I also think I have respect for Ya'alon and Lapid saying, you know what? This guy Bibi is so untrustworthy, that's going too far. So I think it was a very difficult call, and I think the fact that the party split shows just how difficult a call it was. And waiting for the...
Okay. I'm going to kind of group two together. If there actually is an annexation, what do you think Jordan will do? And seems like the Palestinians are by and large playing ball with the Israelis these days. Do you have any hope for a breakthrough post-crisis?
Golda Meir famously said that Zionism and pessimism are incompatible. And so I'm always the optimist. I'm always hoping that peace and sanity and unity are just around the corner. And you can laugh at me, but enough of us are old enough on this call to know that if I had told you that in 2020, if in 1976, I had told you in 2020 there'd be peace between Israel and Egypt, you'd call me a fool. You'd say I'm insane. Look, you just had a Yom Kippur War 3 years earlier. If I told you there'd be a 25-year peace with Jordan, you'd say you're insane. So it's the land of possibilities, and we're actually seeing a lot of cooperation these last couple of weeks between the Palestinians and the Israelis, both vis-a-vis Gaza and vis-a-vis Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, because of the coronavirus doesn't respect borders. The coronavirus, as we all know, hits us all. And so there's a lot of underlying cooperation. We've even seen, by the way, our good friends in the BDS movement, in the boycott movement, saying, well, if Israel comes up with a coronavirus vaccine, we'll accept that. And I love that because it just shows how ridiculously hypocritical these people are. They won't take apart their phones with all the Israeli technology, and they certainly won't and they certainly won't give up on any goodies, and they certainly won't give up on any vaccines. But if they have an opportunity to bash Israel, they will. So that's the part about the Palestinians. The big problem remains among the Palestinians is that most Palestinian leaders, none of whom are elected, refuse to acknowledge the state of Israel's existence. Most Palestinian leaders are autocrats and kleptocrats, and they're not democrats. And until we see a real attempt, and by the way, this is something that the Canadian government, the Norwegian government, the British government, the United Nations, the Chinese government need to be pushing, until we see a growth of civil society and a growth of democracy on the ground and among the Palestinians, it's going to be very, very, very hard to have any kind of peace. And Israelis, even many of my friends from the left, are still scarred by Oslo, still scarred by the attempts that Israel made at peace. Was Israel perfect? Of course not. But Israel made major strides. And the result, of course, as you all know, was horrific terrorism. And I think the ball's in the Palestinian court. It's true that Israel holds the power, but the Palestinians have to show some willingness to negotiate. Now, in terms of the dynamics with Hamas, in Gaza, the challenge there too is it's a regime that feeds off its hatred of Israel. And so unless it's willing to find a different rationale, a different approach, it's going to be very difficult to have the kind of progress we need. But again, you know, we all know that crisis is opportunity. And so this might be a moment where there's enough under the radar cooperation that we will get some progress, or at least some protocols in place that that cut down, for example, on the rockets from Gaza, even once the coronavirus disappears. Because notice, the last couple of months, the last couple of weeks have been very quiet. They've been much quieter on the Gaza border than the last couple of months. And that's because Hamas needs Israel's help in dealing with this threat. Perhaps going forward, that can be a first step, because before you get peace, you need stability. As for Jordan and how Jordan will react, I actually share Benny Gantz's worry that, whereas right now, Israel has carte blanche pretty much in the Jordan Valley. There's no real move for Jordan to move back into the Jordan Valley. There's a kind of security understanding in Israel that we need that bandwidth, that band of land between Jerusalem and the heart of the country and Jordan. I think if they start messing with that consensus, if they start messing with that status quo, it will lead to instability in Jordan. And right now, I want stability in Jordan, not instability.
All right, thank you for that. Now maybe we'll switch gears and go back to the election results. One moment, whoops, here we are. Is there an appetite in Israel for election constitutional reform, reducing the number of parties to say 3 or 5? And this person wishes you best wishes to you and your family.
Well, thank you. Absolutely yes, and absolutely not. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, anytime you get a group of Israelis together, and if you start asking them about their elections, their institutions, they will come with a very, very long list of the many dysfunctions that we see, and they'll come up with a list of half a dozen different constitutional suggestions for reform. But when it actually comes to tachlis, as we say, when it actually comes to advancing it, it's rarely been successful at getting any kind of consensus on that. And here's a very interesting insight that Michael Oren, the former U.S. ambassador to, the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. has. He said, comparing Israel and the United States, what we're seeing right now is that Israeli society is much stronger than American society. I have a daughter studying in Chicago, Leah, and to be honest with you, there are some nights where I read the tea leaves and I worry about potential riots in Chicago, especially in the south side of Chicago where she lives. I have no worry about riots and civil unrest in Israel. And you saw the charming skit from Eretz Nehederet, the charming, and these are the satirists, these are the cynics, these are the comics of Israel. So the society, as I said at the end, is very, very strong. Institutionally, there's a certain problem. We have a prime minister, you can love him or hate him, who has spent a lot of time attacking the courts, attacking the police, attacking the attorney general. That's not a good recipe for institutional stability. In the United States, you also have a president who's done that, but the institutions of the United States have been able to absorb that much more. So I think there is a conversation going on about what kind of constitutional reform might help, but I think fundamentally there is no consensus. And that's why I say absolutely yes and absolutely not. And back to you, Wendy.
Okay, yes, thank you. I'm just kind of trying to manage the reading and listening and
Sure.
everything else. Let's see. Do you want to ask this one? Let's see. Can you comment on the possibility of Bibi forming a government without Gantz by having Hendel Hauser and Orly Levy Abakassis join him?
Good question. So indeed, once the party start popping apart, then you can start picking off certain people from the right who are identified now as the left. And let's step back for a second also. We're using shorthand of right and left. what passes for the Israeli left these days, if it includes Benny Gantz and Bogi Ya'alon and Hauser and Hendel, is a very, very right-wing left. It's not your Labor Party left, and you see how few votes there are for Labor, for Meretz. It's a very centrist left, and basically we're all falling into the language of Bibi Netanyahu, who calls anybody who disagrees with him a Smolani, a left-winger. So Avigdor Lieberman, who, you know, the Russian leader of Yisrael Beitenu, is as right as anybody in the mainstream of Israeli politics, all of a sudden becomes a leftist when he disagrees with Bibi, when he criticizes Bibi. So theoretically, is it possible to pick these people off? Yes. But in practice, I think that the right-wing voices who joined Kahol Lavan made it very clear that that as much as they didn't want Bibi, what they really didn't want was Bibi with a right-wing government, because then they really will have Bibi unleashed, Bibi unbraked, and these are people. Someone like Yoaz Hendel was someone who was an advisor to Bibi, and by the way, it's very interesting to see Bennett, Lieberman, Hendel. So many key leaders of Israeli politics once were very close to Bibi, and they broke with him at one point or another, or he broke with them. And so I think the chances of Hendel going in and being the guy who creates a right-wing coalition that gives Bibi no breaks, no holds barred, is slim. But it is the Middle East; anything could happen.
Don't know if there's anything new coming up.
So there are two elephants in the room we haven't mentioned while you potentially reload, Wendy. One is the whole question of Gantz's flirtation with the joint list with the Arabs. And let me address that in a second. And two is, I mentioned him briefly, but he looms large over so many political conversations in so many parts of the world today, a man with orange hair known as Donald Trump. So let's take each of those to complete our picture. So one, from a democratic perspective, lowercase d, democracy, I think that the emergence of the joint list is a wonderful step forward. I think that the Israeli Arab Party's ability to put some of their frustrations with one another, some of their squabbling aside, and unite, and basically stand up to some of the really ugly bigotry and demagoguery we've heard from some of our friends on the right is a legitimate democratic response and shows the vitality of Israeli democracy and Israeli society. At the same time, if you look at Arab mayors and you look at the Arab electorate, and then you look at Arab Knesset members, you see something very, very depressing. The mayors tend to be very pragmatic. The electorate tends to be very pragmatic and in a certain way, kind of patriotic. The people who end up in the Knesset representing the Arabs, on the whole, the Israeli Arabs, are not representative of that Israeli Arab consensus, that more pragmatic strain in Israeli Arab politics. And many of the voices in this united Arab party are quite extreme and quite hostile to the state. Now, those of us on the call who've spent time in Quebec know that it's very possible to send someone to the legislature, let's say from the Parti Québécois, who detests the state but doesn't mind earning a pension from the state and getting state power. And we have a similar kind of situation sometimes when we look at some of the people within the joint list. So whereas I wasn't worried or dismayed or upset by the joint list emerging, I wasn't worried, upset, or dismayed by the joint list having 15 seats or potentially even being Her Majesty's opposition, if you will, in a national unity government. The question of whether there would be a unity government doesn't bother me that they're Arabs. It doesn't bother me that they're called the Joint List. It doesn't bother me that the United Arab Parties. But if Gantz had gone into a majority with some of those people, some of the specific voices in that party, that would have been for me crossing a red line. So uniting with the Arabs, not a problem for me. Now I'm speaking very personally. But some of those voices are, to me, outside the mainstream consensus, even within the Israeli Arab world. And some people on the right watching Gantz undergo this flirtation with the Israeli Arab parties were very, very dismayed. I from the start of the Kahol Lavan, had a very strong sense that Bughi Ya'alon, Yair Lapid, Gantz, and Ashkenazi are all, you can love them or hate them, you can disagree with them, but they're patriots. And I don't think that they would ultimately go into a party, into a government with people who are truly, truly unpatriotic, who pass on the ugly lie that Israel is somehow an apartheid state, who feed the delegitimization that we see hurting us on campus and elsewhere. So that was the Israeli-Arab flirtation. But Gantz is very happy, if necessary, to use those 15 Israeli-Arab joint list votes as something to hold over Bibi's head in negotiations and to stay as Speaker of the House. And of course, the two dimensions that we have to talk about with Trump are not just Trump, but the Trump peace plan. And a fuller answer to the important questions about annexation is obviously the Bibi Netanyahu is trying to use the Trump peace plan to link to his desire to go down as the prime minister who annexed the Jordan Valley. And there are two issues we should talk about here, and this also opens up to the question of where we as a Jewish community stand. One of the problems with Trump is, again, you can love him or hate him, but the fact is that Donald Trump is poison to 70 to 80% of the American Jewish community, and a large chunk of the Canadian Jewish community as well. And the kiss of love that Donald Trump gives to Israel when he moves the embassy to Jerusalem, when he annexes the Golan Heights, when he puts pressure on the Palestinian Authority, when he comes out with a peace plan, which if you read it carefully, and I read the entire thing, talks about a need for civic society and education, that kiss of love becomes almost a kiss of political death for a certain part of the American Jewish community and a smaller but still loud voice in the Canadian Jewish community. And that's a problem we have to deal with as a Jewish people, as a united entity. And the second thing, of course, is that, I don't know if you heard, because it's been pushed off, we finally figured out the way to stop constantly talking about the American presidential election is to have this horrific coronavirus. But there still is an election going on. And one of the things affecting Netanyahu's timetable is speculation about, will there be a second Donald Trump term? Or will Joe Biden or someone else defeat him? And obviously everybody's reading tea leaves. A lot depends on markets. A lot depends on how this virus plays out. A lot depends on Biden's health, on Trump's health. Let's point out that both Biden and Trump, and I wish them no ill, are in that demographic that's most susceptible, most vulnerable to the coronavirus. So there are many, 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 many imponderables between now and November, but the Donald Trump shadow is definitely a cloud in the conversation in Israel.
I have a question getting back to the original nature of the call. What is the nature of the disagreement between Bibi and Benny Gantz regarding the Supreme Court and its powers?
Okay, so there are two dimensions to it. One is ideologically, constitutionally. If theoretically in the United States of America, you have separation of powers and the courts are supposed to be equal to the legislative and equal to the executive. And they play a game of rock, scissors, papers match where they have countervailing powers. In Israel, traditionally, like a parliamentary democracy based on the British model, the legislature and the prime minister representing the legislative power has power over the courts, and the courts can put some limits. Over the years, the courts, especially led by Justice Aaron Barak in the 80s and 90s, the Israeli court started becoming more and more powerful, more and more, if I can use the expression, the court of last resort for left-wingers who were losing at the ballot box, losing power at the Knesset. And so inevitably, the right, which is on the whole dominated Israeli politics legislatively, democratically since the 1990s, started saying, whoa, wait a minute. If we truly are a democracy, we shouldn't have these justices constantly putting their power over us. And so ideologically, Bibi Netanyahu is in the camp that says we have to clip the court's wings. We have to limit the court's power. And Benny Gantz, as part of the people who came in critiquing Bibi Netanyahu, said, well, you know what? I don't mind having some breaks on the prime minister in general, on the Knesset in general, and particularly this prime minister, this Knesset. That's the
Okay.
ideological debate. Just when we're sentenced, the way it's playing out politically is over judicial appointment. And Gantz is trying to make sure that Blue and White has the power to appoint and more input, and Bibi is trying to limit it. Sorry, Wendy.
No, thank you for that. We're we're going to try to wrap up within the hours. So I just would like to thank you, but to end with this question: what would you suggest we do at our Seder's tomorrow night to take this COVID situation and transmit a meaningful message to the next generation?
Well, thank you for that. That's a beautiful way to end. First of all, I actually put together a supplement of Zionist texts that particularly respond to the coronavirus situation. And I'll be very happy to send the PDF to Lance afterwards, and you can spread it to these people and anybody else whom you wish. So I think it's actually, like all crises in life, an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity. First of all, the Seder is going to be more intimate, and sometimes we get lost with big Seders, and we don't have a chance to really have what we call the I vow, the intense conversation about what are we doing here. I would like to invite and challenge every single one of the grandparents on the call to tell your story, tell your Jewish narrative. This is your chance to and if you're doing on Zoom, I think one of the crazy things about Zoom sometimes is it's hard to have a natural conversation. And I think the Seder leader, if you're doing it on Zoom, even assign beforehand, say, you know, dad or granddad, I'd love for you to take 3 minutes, 5 minutes, say, why is this meaningful to me? What does this Jewish story mean to me? This is our chance, folks. This is our chance to say, yes, at this moment of crisis, let's think of two things. One, let's think about how lucky we are to have one another. Let's think about how lucky we are to be in this chain of transmission of generation to generation and what we've learned from that. Speak very personally about what I gain, what the values I gain. And we also can pull back and we can say, yes, we're having a coronavirus Seder. I'm calling it the coronavirus Sederette because many of them will be much smaller. But we're also aware that we Jewish people have had Seders during times of pogroms, during times of Holocaust, during other times, and we've overcome. And so let the Seder also be a moment to acknowledge our fears, but to also acknowledge our strength and overcome those fears by not just connecting to one another, not just learning from one another, not just listening to one another, but also listening to our story, listening to our past. And, you know, I'm not arrogant enough to say that we're the best or we're the only, but we've got a pretty special story. We've got a pretty amazing story. We've got a story of a people from 3,500 years of exile, 2,000 years of exile, 3,500 years of conversation, who finally came home to their land, finally came home to rebuild. And wherever we live, in Israel, in Canada, in the United States, in Mexico, we work together, we build together, we care together. And that's an extraordinary gift that we can tell our kids, you know what? We've each had moments over these last couple of weeks of feeling very isolated, feeling very alone. But the playwright David Mamet says, real life consists in belonging. One of the things I think we've seen from the social deprivation is our need as humans to connect. And I would like to encourage all of you to take these moments to connect in a very profound way. Do the rituals, but look at the rituals as a moment to also think about God. Think about bigger questions, you know, disease, mortality. These raise questions about meaning in life, about the deeper questions in life. But but also to look at the opportunities we have as a community, as a people, as Zionists, as tremendously generous philanthropists to give, to build, to give back. And we know that when we give back, when we really invest our heart and soul, we get so much back as well. So I want to thank you again, wish you all a happy and safe and healthy Pesach. I want to send special, special regards to the good friends I see on the call, and special, special regards to the good friends of the future who I see on the call and who I hope to meet and greet in Jerusalem in very short order. Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Wendy. Thank all of you.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to hear from you, and it's moving and with information and such good words. So thanks again, Gil, and everyone for joining us on this afternoon before this first Seder.
And I'll give you the proper shake and wish you a Chag Sameach.